Patrick C. While I agree that being ecumenical is a slippery, dangerous slope, working alongside Catholics, 5-point Arminians, etc., would you say it is biblically acceptable for us in the Calvinist camp to work alongside Reformed Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, etc., in things such as abortion, abolition, missions trips, etc.? Yeah. It was a pleasure to meet you, Patrick. I enjoyed meeting you guys and getting to spend some time with the church there, with Faithful Stones in Buffalo, New York, at a conference that I was invited to speak at last week. So that was a pleasure. But to your question, I think that, if that's what you're citing as examples, Reformed Baptists, Presbyterians, absolutely. Anglicans, it would depend. Some Anglicans are more faithful, and some Anglicans have completely denied the gospel, that they would not even qualify as being Orthodox. And so it would depend with Anglicanism. That's kind of what you had with Martin Lloyd-Jones and I believe it was John Stott that had a lot of arguments with one another over whether they should stay and try to reform Anglicanism, or whether they should leave because it was heading in such a bad direction. But so I can't speak for all Anglicans, and I'm not familiar enough with Anglicanism to know, what percentage of Anglicanism is Orthodox and how Orthodox it is. But I will just speak, using your example of Presbyterian and Reformed Baptists. I think Presbyterians and Reformed Baptists should be able to partner on everything, except for baptizing babies. I think that we should be able to partner on everything, on ending abortion, abolishing abortion. There are Presbyterian abolitionists and there are Reformed Baptist abolitionists. I think that we should be able to absolutely partner on those kinds of things. The conference that I'm going to be holding May 5th through the 7th of next year, it's called the Theonomy and Postmillennial Conference. Focusing exclusively on the goodness and the rightness of God's law, and how to apply it to every realm of life, including the political and economic spheres, and then the hopefulness that faithfulness to God will ultimately, maybe not in our lifetime, but ultimately will be successful. Everyone believes that Christ wins. The postmillennialist believes that Christ wins through his church. The premillennialist believes that Christ will win despite a losing church, a dying church. The postmillennialist believes that Christ will win through a victorious church, that Christ is reigning now and he will continue of the increase of his government. There will be no end. He is continuing to expand his rule and reign through the church on earth. The church is the tip of the spear, and that's not through coercion. That's not the church, not an ecclesiocracy where the church becomes the head of the state and bears the sword. No, God is changing the world, advancing his kingdom on earth right now through the church, not through coercion, but through persuasion. Not a sword, physical sword that belongs to the state, and I do believe in a separation of church and state, but rather a spiritual sword that has been given to the church, and that as the church continues to seek to be faithful to fulfill the Great Commission, which includes preaching the gospel and conversion and baptism, but it also includes discipleship with teaching people to obey all of Christ's commands. And I think implicit in that, teaching people to obey all of Christ's commands in every realm of life, including civil politics. As the church does that, as it does that faithfully and stops being pietists, but actually chooses to be Christians, faithful Christians, the world, I believe, will change. And so with this conference, Theonomy and Postmillennialism, May 5th through the 7th in Georgetown, Texas, I've got Dr. Joe Boot, Dr. Gary DeMar, and Dr. James White, and myself. Some are Baptist, some are Presbyterians, and yet we are happy and excited to partner with one another in encouraging Christians to know the law of God, to esteem and cherish the law of God, and to apply the law of God with an eager and hopeful expectation that obedience to Christ matters and that it actually makes an effect on the world that we live in. That's theonomy and postmillennialism. I understand that there are more particular elements of theonomy, and again, there's a sliding spectrum of how theonomic you are. But again, in general, this is a generalization, but in general, theonomy and postmillennialism is simply saying God's law and God's law works. God's law and God's law works. And we've got both Baptists in this conference and Presbyterians that agree on that point, and we are excited to partner together. So I think we can partner with Presbyterians and Baptists on a lot of things, but that's in part because I'm speaking of particular Baptists, Reformed Baptists, and Reformed Presbyterians are both Reformed. But partnering beyond that with people who are not Reformed, I would say you can still partner, but you partner on less. Like, for instance, I've had guys on my show, Steve Dace from The Blaze. I like Steve. I think he is a genuine Orthodox, born-again Christian, but he's not Reformed. He's not a Calvinist. And he's, as far as I can tell, he's not postmillennial. But he has a very keen sense of the political landscape, and he has a spine, and he's bold, and he's not interested in a mere conservative resurgence. He's not interested in just getting the nation back to 2008 Obama, but he actually wants to see revival. He says all the time, revival or bust. I would say reformation or bust. But he says when it comes to America, we can't just turn the clock back 10 years. We can't just walk slower to hell. It's Christ or chaos. Steve will say that, Christ or chaos, revival or bust. I would say reformation or bust. And so me and Steve can partner, and we have. And I hope that we continue to. We can partner on plenty of things, but we will be able to partner on less things than I would be able to partner, for instance, with Toby Sumter and, Gabriel Wrench and Chalk Knox. And so, because we also, there are differences between us, but less differences. So yeah, I think in this particular moment, when the enemy is at the gates, you need every fighting man you have. And so I think that if you got some Arminians who are willing to fight, best example I could think of is Calvary Chapel. I don't like Calvary Chapel's theology. Calvary Chapel doesn't believe in church membership. Calvary Chapel is Arminian. Pretty much all Calvary Chapel is premillennial. Calvary Chapel, their theology sucks. But when the state came with their tyranny with COVID, a bunch of Reformed guys who have better theology, they weren't willing to actually apply any of it. They turned out to be pietists. And they closed their church down, not for a few weeks, but for months and months, and then mandated masks. You can't come to the Lord's table at church. You can't come to Christ unless you have faith plus a mask. Anytime you start doing faith plus, that's not a good sign. Reform guys did that. And a bunch of Calvary Chapel, Arminian, premillennial, anti-church membership guys like Jack Hibbs in California stood their ground and said, no, this is nonsense. And they stood their ground just as firm, if not more firm, than John MacArthur did. So, yeah, in this particular moment, I think a lot of arguments, theological arguments, some of them it's just, like you said, Patrick, some of them it's, this guy's a heretic, we can't partner. But a lot of theological arguments within the overarching banner of orthodoxy, a lot of theological arguments are the luxury of times of peace. But in times of war, you take every fighting man you can get. America is willing to team up with the French if Great Britain is trying to destroy us. Doesn't mean we're always going to be fans of the French, but desperate times call for some alliances. Big news, really big news. Our next Right Response Conference is in the works. We've got a number of things already lined up and organized. This is what we got so far. The whole conference, 3 days long, on postmillennialism and theonomy. And the speakers, Dr. James White, Dr. Joseph Boot, Gary DeMar, and of course yours truly, Pastor Joel Webbon. We've got a great lineup. We've got great topics. If you want to find out dates and location and registration and anything else, go and visit our website, rightresponseconference.com. rightresponseconference.com.